Okay, let's talk about love and desire. Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome to Psycho Bible, babbling about psychology and theology. As I mentioned last video, love develops by way of attraction, desire, and goodwill. But I wanted to discuss desire more in a separate video. Desire is often the most powerful of the different essences of love. It results from the fact that persons are limited beings. We're not self-sufficient. Therefore, we need other beings. We go mad if we're in isolation or if we're lacking community and just intimacy. Children need a mom and a dad, and as well as siblings and extended family, to thrive, let alone to come into existence. And obviously, we need two persons of the opposite sex to form a union that brings life. As Karol Wojtyla, later Pope John Paul II, points out in Love and Responsibility, for humans, sex itself is a limitation, an imbalance. An individual human is insufficient for existence. The fact that we're made male and female shows that one member of the human species is not sufficient on his own without the other opposite sex. So as I've been saying, attraction starts with recognizing a particular good. In this case, the good of forming a sexual union and reproducing. So sex has both a unitive function and a reproductive function. And once you recognize that good, you desire to unite with it. In large part, this is instinctive and unconscious. It's not something that we're like, oh, there's a woman and it would be good for me to unite with her so I can procreate and continue the human species. No, it's not a thing you're constantly thinking. It's built in and it's ingrained. And so we're unconsciously motivated to unite and then reproduce. As he says in page 81, this objective ontological need makes itself felt through the sexual urge. This is what we call love as desire, for it originates in a need and aims at finding a good which it lacks. Wojtyla is careful to point out that there's a difference between love as desire, amor concupiscentia in Latin, and desire itself, concupiscentia, especially sensual desire. When we overly focus on certain aspects of the sexual or marital union, such as the pleasure of sexual intercourse, or also things like the financial stability in sharing resources together, or companionship to cure loneliness, the desire for those aspects can displace the desire for union with the person, for the good of the person. Therefore, union with the person is more so a utilitarian means of satisfaction of the desire for those aspects being fulfilled. Wanting to get with someone to get that orgasm, to get money, to cure loneliness. Those becomes the things we seek rather than true union with another person. Is this type of desire that Jesus warns against when he said in Matthew 5:28, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. For this reason, we cannot reduce love to desire itself. We need to recognize that love as desire is distinct from lustful desire, or the intention to lust after someone. Because love is a longing for the person as a whole. As Karol Wojtyla says, desire goes together with this longing, but is, so to speak, overshadowed by it. The subject in love is conscious of its presence, knows that it is there, at his or her disposal, so to speak, but working to perfect this love will see to it that desire does not dominate, does not overwhelm all else that love comprises. For even those that are not intellectually aware of it may sense that if desire is predominant, it can deform love between man and woman and rob them both of it. So this brings us to how we can know the difference between love and lust. The posture and attitude of love is one of giving of oneself, giving for the good of the other. Remember our definition of love. To love is to will the good of the other. So the posture of love is to give, to unite with someone else for a bond that contributes to the other's actualization of their greatest goodness, their full potential. Whereas lust boils down to use. The posture of lust is using the other, taking from the other. So instead of giving, the posture or the attitude of lust is to take and possess for your own good, and only your own good. And it may just be a perceived good, not your actual good. With this in mind, we know that lust is about more than just the direction of your desire. We tend to think that sexual desire is only problematic if it's directed towards someone who is not your wife, or your husband if you're a woman. But lusting after my wife is not automatically justified because it's for my wife. The nature of my desire also matters. Therefore, I can desire my wife, but it can be lustful, and therefore wrong, if my intent is to just use her for my own sensual gratification, to experience an orgasm, just benefit myself, or obtain some sort of perceived good for me. This is probably the main problem with the so-called purity movement of the 1990s and early 2000s. Young Christian men were basically sold the best future sex ever if they would just abstain from premarital sex. Then God will bless them with a beautiful, sexy wife who will be there to satisfy their every sexual urge. I've seen some authors advise that if you masturbate while fantasizing about your future wife, even if she's just imaginary. But this doesn't facilitate a future loving relationship, but a lustful one. Teens, girls especially, were taught that their virginity was the most precious gift they could ever offer. But they were given only a technical definition of virginity, as vaginal intercourse. So naturally, teens find loopholes, and they lost all conviction against doing every other sexual act as long as they remain a virgin in the technical sense. But that doesn't protect you from all the brokenness that comes from being used. We're still setting our kids up, and teens and young adults, up for being used as objects for gratification. And we're seeing now in the hookup culture, in the surrounding culture, which I also see as a Christian college counselor, pervades the Christian community as well. We're seeing the emptiness and the brokenness and the betrayal and the pain left from just viewing people as objects to be used, even if it's as friends with benefits or as just a meaningless hookup. Now, the solution isn't to abandon sexual virtues altogether, like I'm seeing these embittered deconstructionists doing. In their crusade to liberate people from legalism and scrupulosity, they're just enslaving them to their passions. No, the solution is developing virtues, such as prudence, continence, and fortitude. And instead of a culture of purity, we need a culture of chastity. Because purity is all really just about abstinence. Not only is that an all or nothing attitude, you either have your virginity or you don't. You either totally abstain or you don't. But it's inadequate, for it does little to address the desires that motivate sexual sin. So it leads to pretty much just white-knuckling it. It doesn't help people get to understanding what are these desires? And how do I understand the goodness of these desires? And how to properly direct them? Especially until I'm able to direct them more fully with a spouse. See, chastity is actually about the right ordering of desire. And that's why it's a higher virtue than just mere abstinence. So it's important that we understand the nature of desire, especially the theological term concupiscence, which is more commonly understood as the lust of the flesh, or carnal desire. How our physical cravings can lead us into sin by way of use. Now, first, we need to understand sensuality and distinguish it from desire or concupiscence itself. Let's start by understanding that the orientation of sensuality is a matter of spontaneous reflexes. In this form, it is not primarily an evil thing, but a natural thing. Wojtyla says, this natural orientation, which is inherent in the spontaneous physiological sexual processes, is communicated to the senses. Hence, sensuality expresses itself mainly in an appetitive form. A person of the other sex is seen as an object of desire, specifically because of the sexual value inherent in the body itself. For it is in the body that the senses discover that which determines sexual difference, sexual otherness. This value reaches the consciousness by way of an impression, where the impression is accompanied by an emotion, experienced not only mentally, but bodily. Sensuality is connected with the stirrings of the body, especially in its so-called erogenous zones. The promptings of sensuality would give man all the guidance he needs in his sexual life if, in the first place, his sexual reactions were infallibly guided by instinct, and if, in the second place, the object of those reactions, a person of the other sex, did not demand a different attitude from that which is proper to sensuality. So what does that mean? Well, briefly, it means that we could trust the sexual promptings of our sensuality if it was infallible, and it's not. And if that was the only proper way to respond to another person, and it's not, because it doesn't recognize the whole person. So let's get into that. But first, the main point in that whole paragraph is that sensuality is more akin to attraction and arousal. It's involuntary and spontaneous. It's a bodily reaction. It's your body reacting to what the senses are taking in. At an unconscious level, your senses are made aware of the sexual value of the other, and excitement is triggered. This is not the same thing as lust or desire. Confusion over this point is a cause of a lot of illegitimate shame and guilt, of which we'll explore more in a separate video, particularly as it relates to homosexuality. So, to be clear, just because you find yourself physiologically aroused by someone or something, it doesn't mean that's what you actually desire, or even what you're desiring in that moment, let alone what you're desiring deep down in your core. Rather, your senses are picking up on something that matches an arousal template. There's a part of you that perceives a good in there. That's what brings up attraction, like we talked about last video. And so it brings up something that triggers your arousal template. That is either innate because of our natural erogenous zones, or is acquired by some sort of a past experience or some sort of association that you've made. For example, all right, real talk, my ears are definitely erogenous zones. I don't care who you are. You could be my wife, you could be a complete stranger, you could be a dude or a woman, an old man, or an old lady. You whisper in my ears, I'm going to feel a bit of a tickle. Okay, that's just, there's something about that that stimulates me. So that's just sensuality. That does not mean that's what I actually desire. And I'm not committing any sort of lust or sin just by having that reflexive, spontaneous, involuntary experience. Sensuality in itself is actually blind to the person. It's oriented only towards the sexual value that's connected with the body, what physical senses we're picking up on from the other person. For this reason, it is characteristically fickle, turning wherever it finds that value, wherever a possible object of enjoyment appears. See, the external senses and the internal sense, like imagination and memory, signal the presence of such an object. And sensuality can insinuate itself into situations in a totally uninvited manner. So without you even seeking it out, you can have a sensual experience. Now, just because sensuality is not lust and is not voluntary, doesn't mean you're off the hook if you have disordered or hyper experiences of sensuality, because sensuality easily leads into lust. Therefore, intrinsic to the call to maturity is developing self-mastery and progressively aligning your whole self with God's design and intent for you. We are called to magnanimity, to pursue our maximum potential in maturity and integration. It's below our dignity as humans, as persons, to just be driven by our sensuality or to be defined by our sensuality. As Wojtyla says, let us add that in man there can be no such thing as pure sensuality, such as exists in animals, nor of the infallible regulation of sensual reactions by instinct, meaning your instinct cannot infallibly regulate your sensual reactions. It's going to go off the urges that they trigger. So he continues, what then is completely natural in animals becomes subnatural in man. This further means that sensuality by itself is not love, and may very easily become its opposite. It's rather a raw material for true conjugal love, but it's not love itself. So when I see my wife, and I'm like, whoa, wow, she's hot. She's gorgeous. She stirs things up within me. That's not love. But it's part of the raw material for love. So that needs to be properly directed and regulated so that I may actually express love to her, not just for her body, but for her person. The yearning for a sexual value connected with the body as an object of use demands integration. It must become an integral part of a fully formed and mature attitude to the person, or else it is certainly not love. Sensuality must then be open to the other, more nobler elements of love, in particular, goodwill. So that's sensuality. What distinguishes concupiscence or lust from sensuality is the choice to act on sensuality. It's active. It's about seeking the fulfillment or the outlet for an expression of the sexual urge that the sensuality triggers. So in this way, sensuality is expended in concupiscence, meaning it's like the currency of concupiscence. The word is appropriate here because carnal concupiscence is oriented towards finding an outlet. Wojtyla says, carnal concupiscence is closely linked with sensuality. The analysis of sensuality carried out in the preceding chapter showed that it typically reacts to the body as a possible source of enjoyment. Sensuality reacts to sexual values connected specifically with the body, and this reaction has a directive character. Nevertheless, it is not to be identified with lust. It merely orients the whole psyche towards the sexual values, awakening an interest in, or indeed an absorption in them. Absorption meaning like you kind of zone out, you focus in on it. It is a very easy transition from this first stage in a sensual reaction to the second, which is concupiscence. Concupiscence differs from mere sensual interest or even absorption in the sexual values connected with the body. Where they are concerned, we may say that the values impinge upon the subject, while concupiscence implies that the subject actively seeks the value in question. something in the subject begins to strive towards, to hanker after that value. A spontaneous process is set up in the subject which culminates in the desire to possess the value. Sensual concupiscence is not yet the desire to possess, but has a marked tendency to develop into it. The obvious ease of transition from each stage to the next, from the arousal of interest to sensual concupiscence, from sensual concupiscence to carnal desire, is the source of great tension in the inner life of the person. And it is in connection with them that the virtue of continence, which is self-control, comes into action. Thomas Aquinas made a distinction between desire from the urge to act. Having the urge to act upon sensual feelings is also not lust until it is acted upon. So when we talk about sexual feelings, we need to be careful to distinguish between feelings as desire or as urges, because emotions are characterized by one or the other, and feelings range in intensity from those initial stirrings to sustained emotional states. To be clear, there are different ways of acting on desires. To give in to lust doesn't just mean to now go and view porn or to masturbate or to try to have sex with someone. Okay? That's a physical way. That's what we call an external act. But there are also internal acts, such as fantasizing your mind, ruminating and entertaining the initial stirrings, to covet someone. Okay? The Ten Commandments addresses both the external and internal. We're told not to steal as well as not to covet, not to commit adultery as well as, when not to covet, to not covet your neighbor's wife. So we see God is concerned not just with what you do with your body, but also what you do with your thoughts and your mind, which requires an act of will either way. And that act of will is to use that other person, even if it's totally unbeknownst to them, as an object for use. However, a human person cannot be an object for use. That's not the proper way for a person to be treated, going back to our first video on the personalistic norm. Now, the body is an integral part of the person, so we try to make the distinction. I'm not trying to use the person, I'm just using their body. I just find them really attractive. I'm just appreciating their beauty. But we need to remember that you are your body and you are your spirit. A person is a body-spirit composite, the two combined. So to just try to use someone's body, you're also using them as a person. And so it's inappropriate to just use someone for their body. That's a disintegrated sort of approach to other people. So here you can really see where the moral danger of carnal concupiscence lies. It leads to a love which is not love. A love which provokes erotic feelings based on nothing but sensual desire and its satisfaction. These feelings have as their object a person of the other sex, in typical heterosexual situations, yet do not rise to the level of the person, since they do not go beyond the body and sex as their proper and sole content. The result is the non-integration of love. Carnal concupiscence impels, very powerfully impels, people towards physical intimacy, towards sexual intercourse. But if this grows out of nothing more than concupiscence, it does not unite a man and a woman as persons. It does not have the value of a personal union, and it is not love in the true, i.e. the ethical, sense. On the contrary, physical intimacy, sexual intercourse, or some other sexual act, which grows out of concupiscence and nothing more, is a negation of the love of persons, for it rests on the impulse to enjoy, which is characteristic of pure sensuality. That impulse must be tied into a correct and respectful attitude to the person. This is what we mean by integration. So we must understand that there's a serious threat of love being deformed and its raw material being squandered. The actions of carnal concupiscence treat the person as just an object for your enjoyment. And so what's the best protection from this? Complete security against carnal concupiscence is something we find only in the profound realism of virtue, and specifically the virtue of chastity. This brings us to the solution to the dangers of concupiscence. And the solution is self-giving. As previously mentioned, the posture of lust is to use or to take, but the posture of love is to give. In integrated and mature love, each partner understands their call to be a gift of self. If God is love, and love means to will the good of the other, to contribute to full actualization of another's potential goodness, and we're made in God's image, and God is love, then that means that the core of our nature is to be a gift of love. And God's love always brings life. We see Jesus leading in this example in Ephesians 5:25-26. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy. Now, what did he give up for his bride? His self, his whole self. And we remember that. We participate in that when we take communion or the Eucharist. He gave of his body and his blood, and we partake of it, and we take him into us. To give of oneself means to limit one's freedom on behalf of another. This is the kenotic, coming from the word kenosis, which means self-giving or self-emptying. This is the kenotic love of Jesus described in Philippians 2:1-11, one of my favorite passages. If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any fellowship with the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, like held on to, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross, the most humiliating way to die back then. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place, and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So we see in Jesus' own example that limitation of one's freedom might seem to be something negative and unpleasant, but love makes it a positive, joyful, and creative thing. It led to Jesus being exalted and glorified ultimately, even though he suffered. But he had to do it freely. He chose, he was not forced to. He willingly chose to give of himself. That's freedom. That is using your freedom to will the good of the other. Freedom exists for the sake of love. If freedom is not used, is not taken advantage of by love, it becomes a negative thing and gives human beings a feeling of emptiness and unfulfillment. If you're giving so-called love out of a sense of obligation or coercion, then it feels oppressive and it leads to resentment. Love must be volunteered. Love commits freedom and imbues it with that to which the will is naturally attracted: goodness. The will aspires to the good, and freedom belongs to the will. Hence, freedom exists for the sake of love, because it is by way of love that human beings share most fully in the good. But man longs for love more than for freedom. Freedom is just the means, and love is the end. Someone's sexuality tends to just stand out to us. It imposes itself. But the value of the person waits to be chosen and affirmed. Therefore, if you haven't given in to your passions yet, your will is now the battleground between the sexual instinct and your need for freedom. Now you may be thinking, well, I don't just want my partner for sex, I desire the whole partner. But mere desire for the person is not full love, because it could just be that you desire that person as a means to your happiness, to your fulfillment in some way, not just sexual, but maybe some other type of happiness, and you're just considering yourself. Well, I want this person for my happiness. I'd be so happy if I was with this person. But when you really desire the good, that means you want the good not just for you, but for the other person as well. So in this way, you'll have to consider what would be for that person's best, for their good. So some relationships you learn you might have to let go, because it wouldn't be good for them to be with you. So that causes a tension between the will, which desires the good ultimately, and the sexual urge. Because the sexual instinct wants above all to take over, to make use of another person, whereas love wants to give, to create a good, to bring happiness. This is the divine aspect of love. To desire unlimited good for another person is really to desire God for that person. He alone is the objective fullness of the good, and only His goodness can fill every man to overflowing. It is through its connection with happiness, with the fullness of the good, that human love comes closest to God. I said earlier that desire rises up from the simple fact that persons are limited beings. We're always in need of other beings, and the chief being we need is God Himself. Realization of the limitation and insufficiency of the human being is the starting point for an understanding of man's relation to God. Man needs God, as does every other creature, simply in order to be, to exist. So God gave us our sexual cravings, urges, desires as just an echo, ultimately, of our truest desire, our desire and longing for Him. As Augustine said in his Confessions, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." God made us male and female and called us to unite in marriage to reflect the truth that we are destined for Him. Every longing for union that we experience in this life is a sign of our deepest longing for union with Him. Just as true love as desire means that I recognize my wife as a good for me, and I am a good for her, so too I desire God because I recognize Him as a good for me. So, I hope this video was enlightening and got some gears turning for you. I pray it stirs you to get in touch with your deepest desire for union with your Creator, the lover of your soul. In our next part, we'll be talking about what makes a loving relationship. So stay tuned by liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. And until next time, please remember, Jesus loves you freely, fully, faithfully, and fruitfully.